This is my third time. It's my third time in Turkey. The first time I was here was 2005. I drove from Syria across the border into Haber and then down into Iraq. It's extraordinary to be back here. There's many things that I love about Turkey. The first is this is one of the most important markets for Google. The second is I think the entrepreneurial spirit of the Turkish people is truly unrivaled. And the third is something much more personal, which is 5 years ago, I met my wife. And we had been dating about 3 months, and we decided that we would take a trip together to make sure that we actually liked each other. So we went to Istanbul and spent a week, and I have to say, it worked out very well. We love the city, and now we're married and have a nice daughter. So I'm eternally grateful to this wonderful country for the success of my marriage. So thank you for that. But I'm not going to talk about that today. What I'm here to talk to you about today is a supplement to what I understand the conversation has been throughout this conference. You all have been talking about the digitization of business. One of the things that I want to talk about in the new digital age as the world comes online is what the digitization of world affairs and geopolitics looks like around us, because it's fundamentally changing the business environment, the environment in which we live, the environment in which we look for consumers and to grow our businesses. And before I do that, I want to start with a quote from my favorite obscure American inventor. His name is Charles Kettering, and he once remarked that we should all be concerned about the future because we're going to have to spend the rest of our lives there. Now, I like this quote, in part because it's charming, but it's also fundamentally true, much more so than it was in the past. So historically, every generation could experience, or could expect to experience maybe 1 or 2 great technological innovations in their lifetime. So in that sense, historically, the future used to be much easier to predict. So I think about my parents' generation, they had the television and the fax machine and so forth. But for my generation and generations that follow me, we should expect that we're going to experience some kind of groundbreaking, seismically changing technological innovation at least once every 2 to 3 years. In fact, so extraordinary is the pace of this innovation that all of us in the tech sector have determined it impossible to predict technology more than roughly 7 to 10 years into the future. And even then, we rarely get it right. So the pace of change is happening so fast that the unpredictability of the future is both exciting and scary at the same time. But before I talk about where we're going, I think it's important to understand in terms of this technological revolution, where we came from and where we are today. Now, what do we mean when we talk about the technological revolution? Most of the discourse around all of this change typically centers around the scale, the ubiquity, the speed, the gadgetry, and I think it's worth sharing or starting with some basic facts and figures. So since the year 2000, the number of people worldwide using the internet has grown from roughly 361 million users to well over 2.4 billion users. In that same time period, we've gone from 907 million mobile phone subscriptions worldwide to now over 6.2 billion mobile phone subscriptions. Think about how extraordinary that number is. And more of them are becoming smartphones. The story of video is remarkable. You have 100 hours of YouTube footage uploaded every single minute. You have 6 billion views per month. It would take Hollywood 43,000 years to produce the same length content that is uploaded to YouTube in a single year. And yes, somebody at Google actually did the math on that. Google has photographed more than 5 million miles of roads. Just to put it in perspective, that's enough to go to the moon 10 times and back. We're activating more than 1.5 million Android devices per day. We have more than 1 billion Android users worldwide for an operating system that is just about a decade old. Now, if you're not convinced by these, sort of facts and figures, and I can throw out many more SMSs sent in a single country in one given day than the entire population on Earth, let's look at an age-old battle between communication devices and sanitation that I'm going to make up for purposes of this exercise. Remember, I said there's more than 6.2 billion mobile phones in circulation. Did you know there's only 4.2 billion toothbrushes in circulation? Now, last time I checked, a toothbrush was much cheaper than a mobile device, so we can only guess or assume that people are prioritizing communications access over sanitation. And in India, did you know that there's more mobile devices in circulation than there are outhouses in the entire country? Anyway, I can go on, but I'll sort of finish this little exercise with my favorite statistic, which is more of a reflection of human instinct, which is in the United States, 38% of Americans said that they would give up sex for an entire year before they would give up their mobile device. I don't think anybody's done a similar study in Turkey. I encourage somebody to. The statistics are fascinating. And another 42% of Americans said that they would give up shoes for at least 2 years before they would give up their mobile device. Now, why do I sort of share all these fun facts and figures with you? You know, it's not to impress you with sort of knowledge retention, because I assure you I share these statistics often. It's because what I just said reflects a lot of the conversation that we have around the technological revolution, and yet it tells you almost nothing about what's actually happening. For the simple reason that it doesn't answer the fundamental question about why any of this matters. So for all the focus on speed and access and ubiquity and so forth, why is any of this of real consequence? And let me start with a little exercise. How many of you, by show of hands, find it difficult to imagine functioning day to day without your mobile phones? And I expect some honesty here. So by show of hands, how many of you? Raise them high so I can see. All right, most of you. How many of you, if you left your phone in the other room, would be willing to be 5 minutes late for your next meeting so you could go and get it? Okay. Strangely, I think more of you raised your hand for that. Let me ask a different question. How many of you, if you were waiting for the Marmarai, which is what I understand they call the underground or subway here, if you dropped your phone onto the tracks, would be willing to jump in and get it as the train was coming full speed ahead, knowing that there was at least an 80% chance that you would die? There's always one crazy person in the audience that raises their hand. I will find you afterwards and we can talk about therapy. So the reason I ask is I spend a lot of my time traveling the world, going to some pretty rough and difficult places, asking the question, why does technology matter? And I just made you go through that exercise to show that even though we think we can't live without our phone, we wouldn't actually risk our life for access. We wouldn't actually risk almost certain death to use our mobile device, right? That seems sort of obvious, but there are parts of the world where that's actually true. So I traveled to North Korea about 2 years ago. Strangest place in the entire world, most totalitarian society. So in North Korea, what do you think the punishment is for being caught with a smuggled mobile device? Anyone want to guess? You get the death penalty. And not only do you get the death penalty, they persecute 3 generations of your family. And yet there's over 1 million illegal mobile phones in circulation in this country. And not only do people risk their lives to gain access to one of these smuggled devices, they then risk their lives again to go up to the Chinese border to be able to get a signal. Now, I don't think anyone here is doing business in North Korea, nor would I expect you to, but I do hope that with that anecdote, you never quite look at your phone the same way. Know that something that for us is such a luxury is literally a matter of life and death in certain places. It's unfathomable to us. It's difficult for us to even have a frame of reference for how something like that can be so meaningful that somebody would literally risk their lives for it. In Afghanistan, where I've taken 6 trips, last time I was there, I heard about a village in Helmand province towards the south where the Taliban raided the village. They killed all the citizens, etc. After that happened, the survivors sent text messages to the neighboring village. The Taliban, figuring this out, when they raided the neighboring village, confiscated all the phones. Which of the 2 villages do you think put up the most severe resistance against the Taliban? It was in fact the village where the Taliban confiscated the phones that the villagers ended up fighting back even harder. Because again, in that environment, the phone is a matter of life and death. An even more remarkable example comes from Libya. How many of you, by show of hands, use Google Maps? Hopefully all of you. There's no excuses. And you use Google Maps to get from point A to point B and to get around. During the bombing campaign in Libya that led to the demise of Muammar Gaddafi, like so many of these conflict zones, a lot of children were out of school. So a group of Libyan schoolgirls used Google Maps to plot out where the bombs were falling, where the conflict was happening, so they could find a safe passageway to school, right? Very innovative. So effective and accurate were these maps that the NGOs who were delivering basic humanitarian relief and services decided that the Libyan schoolgirls had better crowdsourced data about the safe way to navigate through the conflict to deliver these social goods, so they started using the maps developed by the Libyan schoolgirls instead of their own. So you think Google Maps are important to get from point A to point B. Again, until you actually go to these places, you don't quite appreciate that it's a matter of life and death in certain situations. There's a village in Kenya called Lodariak that back about 15 years ago when I thought I wanted to be an anthropologist, I used to spend a lot of time. And I stayed in this village that had no electricity, no running water, no roads, and I stayed in one of the huts of this wonderful old man named Mzee Ole Saidimu who had 3 wives and 42 children. Fascinating guy, completely fascinating. I went back to the village a couple years ago, and they still had no running water, still had no roads, still had no electricity. But one thing had changed. All of the Maasai women had these pouches around their neck with a mobile device in it. All of the Maasai warriors had a knife on their belt, just as they always had, but they had another pouch right next to their knife that had a mobile device in it. It was very confusing to me because I wanted to know where on earth they charged their phones. I'm sure all of you were asking this question. It turns out it's not a stupid question. There's one guy in the village who, on market day, takes like big sort of potato sacks and collects all the phones. And the villagers give him a little bit of money. He then goes to Nairobi. It takes him a couple days to get there. He has a couple surge protectors. He sits in hotel lobbies until he gets kicked out, basically sitting around charging all the phones. And then he comes back to the village, and he hands out the phones, and people have enough battery to be able to selectively use them. So then you ask yourself the question, okay, what are they actually using these phones for? Now, Mzee Ole Saidimu, my friend with the 3 wives and the 43 children, said that it changed his life. I assumed it was so he could stay in better touch with his children. He said, no, it changed his life because before the arrival of a mobile device, Mzee Ole Saidimu had to basically guess which market to walk 6 to 10 kilometers to get the best prices for his cows and sheep and goats. He said now he just calls around to figure out where to do his commerce. So even in these nomadic villages that have no physical infrastructure, even in those places, people's lives are getting better. Yes, health may still be very difficult. Yes, poverty may still be tremendous, but everybody's life gets a little bit better because of mobile. Now, there's a fascinating attribute that a lot of these emerging markets and developing markets have, which is I believe that people do more with less. And in some of these emerging markets, there's no greater driver of innovation than necessity. So all of us here have mobile devices. I doubt any of us have ever read the instructions manual. And why would we? We're going to get a new phone next year or in 6 months, and we use it to basically do the basics of calling and talking and texting and whatever else, but we actually don't use probably 90% of our phone's functionality. But in these environments where people have a greater set of needs, they do extraordinary things with this technology. So what you see on the screen here is a young Kenyan man named Anthony Mutua, who is one of these young gentlemen, who was frustrated that despite having a phone that was sort of secondhand and old, the battery kept dying. So what did he do? He invented an ultra-thin crystal chip and found that when you applied pressure to it, it generated power and electricity. He then cut a slit in the sole of his shoe, put the chip in there, had a wire going from his shoe to his phone, and literally charged it by walking like this. None of us would think about that. If my phone died, I would basically just start cursing a lot. And I would get really frustrated, and I would spin around like a Tasmanian devil. But in these environments, people are so resilient, and that necessity drives them to create extraordinary things. So even if the technology is still built in a lot of developed markets, ultimately the people who are going to teach us how to use that technology are people like Anthony Mutua. I'm going to skip over a few of these just for the sake of time, but I want to tell you about Cuba. In Cuba, where you have less than 1% of the population with access to the internet is only available in these government-sponsored cafes where prices are extremely prohibitively expensive. So it basically costs 75% of your monthly salary to use the internet for 1 hour. So most Cubans can't do it. So the handful of Cubans that do have the resources to gain access of the internet basically scrape a bunch of content for it, load it on USB and other devices, and then there's an underground sort of network called the sneaker net, where they hide the storage devices in sneakers and then deliver them to your doorstep, and it's basically the internet in a sneaker. So you grab the sneaker, you cut it open, you pull out your storage device, and you're able to access content from the web. Again, these sort of extraordinary testimonies of resilience. But I'm going to jump to what I think is the most emotionally compelling story, which is on my last trip to Pakistan. I met a group of women who'd been attacked by the Taliban with acid. Now, through no fault of their own, these women have terrible scars on their face that carry an awful stigma in society. A stigma that does not allow them to work, a stigma that does not allow them to engage. So basically, they're forced to live under this, sort of de facto house arrest. So I met all of these women at this home. There were about 20 of them. And when I walked into the room, they were so cheery, they were so optimistic. And I asked one of them to explain to me how she can maintain her level of optimism. And she held up her phone, and she said, "The internet changed my life." And I said, "Can you explain?" She said, "When I go online, my scars are invisible. So the internet has given me a chance to live again." What's even more remarkable is she met a man online. They started chatting. He found her sort of funny and compelling. They eventually met in the physical world. He didn't know about that she was a victim of acid attack. He didn't know about the scars, but he was so in love with her that they eventually got married. So that story to me tells you how the internet is so transformative in a particular demographic where women are disenfranchised, women are victimized, women are sort of forced to endure this terrible normative stigma, and you think about what the internet can do for them. So what I find most compelling is this is only the beginning of what we're about to see. You're going to have another 5 billion people connect to the internet in the next decade. So some of the things that we're going to see on the horizon are near perfect voice recognition, such that if you're a Turkish speaker and I'm an English speaker, we can algorithmically make it so that way we're able to pick up on your accent, your mannerism, your tone, and rather than a robot simultaneously translating the conversation, we'll be able to have a simultaneously translated conversation in whatever accent or tone you want. So let's say I find my mother-in-law's voice particularly charming. I can choose to have a conversation, English to Turkish, translated in my mother-in-law's voice, back to English. We're about roughly 5 to 7 years away from this. 3D printing is going to create entirely new waves of secondary markets. Neuromorphic computing is going to allow us to basically have digitized assistants and digitized staff that will know our habits and our mannerisms and be able to do all sorts of things for us. I think some of the most exciting innovations will be around health. Imagine you're walking down the street and you don't feel well. You reach into your pocket, you grab a smart pill, you put it in your mouth, it makes its way around your digestive system, collects some data on what may or may not be wrong with you, Wi-Fi's that data to your phone, performs a simple algorithm on what may or may not be wrong with you, looks at what insurance you take, what your calendar has in terms of availability, and schedules the entire appointment for you. Amazing, right? Sounds like science fiction. Sounds impossible. There's a pill that does exactly this that has already been created that is just awaiting FDA approval. Of course, the big hurdles with these things are the regulatory environments and privacy and security, but technologically, the things that historically were science fiction are much more in our grasp. In that sense, it's actually more difficult today to think of things that are science fiction than it is to think of things that are reality. That's how fast the change is happening. But we also, we all read the paper, we watch the news. We also realize that if you look at where the next 5 billion people are coming online, they're coming online in some of the most difficult parts of the world. 2/3 of the world's population lives under some kind of censorship. 1 out of every 3 people on Earth lives in a society that is severely censored. You have 36 armed conflicts going around the world. You have threats from ISIS. You have the rise of one state at the expense of another state. The world has challenges. And the world's actually safer and more stable than at any other time in history, but part of the world coming online means that the physical threats that we face are increasingly spilling over into the digital world, and we're getting increased visibility into them. So I want to spend my remaining time talking about some of these threats and how the digital world is impacting them, because I think there's a lot of incorrect assumptions. And I want to start with ISIS and the future of terrorism. ISIS is something that in the last year, it's really all that anybody, at least in my country, can talk about. And there's this assumption that I believe is fundamentally incorrect, that the advent of the internet is fueling radicalization or recruitment or making terrorism easy. Now, we should know that technology has an empowerment bias, and yes, it empowers people for good and for ill. But I think the question we have to ask is, what is the long-term impact on terrorism and criminality in the world when everybody's online? Well, we should start with a fundamental assumption that it's very difficult to imagine a terrorist or a criminal in today's world operating in a cave in Tora Bora and being even remotely relevant. So we should assume that every terrorist of the future is going to opt into technology if they want to actually do their work. Now, my view is by them opting into technology, the likelihood of them making a mistake and it being captured in data permanence goes up, which means that their margin for error goes down significantly. Now, the good news here is while terrorists have had roughly 1,500 years to perfect their tactics in the physical world, they've had single-digit years to learn how to use the internet. And despite the fact that people like to suggest that ISIS and other groups are tech-savvy, I work with tech-savvy people all day. They're not tech-savvy. They have compelling content, they're good marketers, and they're active users of technology, but we're much better at it than they are. And by the way, the number of people who are against violent extremism online significantly outnumbers those who advocate for it, which means that it's really a question of how do you mobilize all of those voices against violent extremism. Now, a way to understand this concept of the margin for error going down for terrorists and criminals is a story that I'll tell you about a $45 million ATM heist that happened about a year and a half ago, where transnational criminals stole $45 million from tens of thousands of ATMs around the world in 8 hours. Largest ATM heist in history, over 8 hours. So it was organized by a transnational criminal ring that was very good at staying off the grid. But they still needed literally thousands of people to go to these ATMs and take the money out. So they enlisted your everyday street criminal. Now, it turns out street criminals aren't the smartest people in the entire world. So a number of them, not one, not a dozen, not even 24, but literally several dozen of them, decided that after stealing the money from the ATMs, it would be a good idea to post pictures of themselves on Instagram celebrating with their sort of illicit cash. Now, these street criminals, again, not being the smartest people in the world, didn't realize that Instagram, by default, geolocates. So law enforcement was able to see where these street criminals were, find them, search their computers, work backwards to figure out the communications they had with the transnational criminal leaders, and they were able to unravel the entire criminal network. You couldn't do that in a sort of era where you didn't have sort of a digital footprint left behind by some of these groups. And there's a long tradition of terrorists and criminals being young, and an even longer tradition of young people doing stupid things and making mistakes. So then you ask yourself the question, what's new? What's new is they're all using technology, and again, those mistakes make it less likely that they succeed in carrying out an attack, and make it more likely that if they are unfortunately successful, you're able to work backwards to figure out who was responsible. So again, technology is a double-edged sword, and terrorism is a tactic that's been around since the beginning of time. But more technology, to me, is a greater vulnerability for these illicit groups than it is a benefit. I want to talk a little bit about the future of conflict and revolution. We've seen more revolutions in the world since December of 2010, beginning with the Arab Spring, than we've seen at any other time in history since 1989, and perhaps even more revolutions since then. And they're still going, most recently in Hong Kong and elsewhere. So what is the observation that we should take away from all of these? Well, despite the initial euphoria around the Arab Spring, the logical or the conclusion that I've come to is that what more technology does is it makes it that revolutions are easier to start, but that they're actually harder to finish. And they're harder to finish for the simple reason that the accelerated pace of movement making that technology ushers in is in fact retarding leadership development. So it used to be that if you look at the Charles de Gaulles, the Lech Walesas, the Nelson Mandelas of the world, it took them decades to emerge as leaders before they became public figures. Now a lot of these revolutions are basically large numbers of people armed with mobile devices in the street around the lowest common denominator, which is typically they want a particular leader out of power. After that, they don't agree on anything. So if you have revolutions that unseat autocratic leaders but don't produce any new leaders with new last names and are able to sort of build a set of institutions that can improve a country, what you're left with is a situation where the stability has been removed, expectations of the population have been increased, and the lack of leaders creates an unstable situation. And this is what you've seen happen in Syria. Now, Syria is interesting for a number of reasons, certainly a huge tragedy, but it's the first civil war where you have a simultaneous physical civil war and cyber civil war happening at the same time. Right? The physical civil war we're aware of, 250,000 people dead, more than 6 million refugees. It's certainly a civil war that's had an impact on this country just by virtue of refugee flows and so forth. But there's something else happening in Syria, which is, we talk a lot about the foreign fighters who are going to fight for either Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS or the Syrian regime. There's another type of foreign fighter that we're seeing emerge in Syria, which are software engineers. A lot of these software engineers from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, are literally joining the Syrian Electronic Army. And they're not leaving their bedrooms. They're not leaving their living rooms. They're doing so remotely. And what are they doing on behalf of the Syrian Electronic Army? They're attacking foreign media sites. They're compromising dissidents. They're phishing. They're DDoS attacking. They're adding a digital dimension to what's happening. But I'll tell you another story that I think shows that the digital and the physical are one and the same. I saw a group of friends of mine during my last trip to the Syrian border a year and a half ago who I hadn't seen in about 10 years. And they told me about what they called social media checkpoints, where the government stops you and asks for your phone. They then ask you for your password to this social networking site or that social networking site. And if you don't give it to them, they threaten you with a gun. So a friend of mine's brother was in this situation. He had to give over his password. And they saw something posted on one of his sites that they didn't like. A signal came from the checkpoint up to the top of a roof where a sniper then shot my friend's brother in the head. And I tell you this story because we need to stop talking about cyberspace and physical space as if they're different worlds. There's one international system. It has a digital front. It has a physical front. And what happens in one impacts the other. I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to quickly breeze through this next one. A lot of people talk about the rise of China. And they talk about the rise of China in terms of it becoming the world's largest economy, in terms of the rise of its military. But there's something else happening in China which is quite interesting. Population of 1.4 billion people. The country is still roughly 70% rural, 30% urban. Something unique is about to happen in China in the next decade, which is you're going to literally have 1 billion people come online all at once. It's going to happen one time in one country, and it will never happen to that scale ever again, just given the size of China's population. So I describe this as digital urbanization, meaning the pace of people coming online is going to happen much faster than physical urbanization. So what I mean by digital urbanization is that 70% of the Chinese population that's physically urban is going to be physically rural is going to be digitally urban. And what that means is despite living in, on the farms and in rural areas, they're going to have access to the marketplace of ideas in urban environments. They're going to get visibility into the cities and what they have and what they don't have. Now, last time I was in China, a group of Chinese intellectuals told me that they think the formula for stability in China is as follows. They don't expect their government to be honest. They do expect their government to be corrupt, but they also expect their economy to grow. And so long as their economy keeps growing north of 7.2% and per capita GDP doubles in the next 10 to 20 years, they said that they can tolerate the corruption, they can tolerate the dishonesty. They said the moment that that formula changes is the moment that they start to question everything. Now, the wild card for a country like China is if the economy slows down and people start to question things and people start to complain about the corruption, the difference between China of the future and China of the past is they'll have the online means to do it. And as much as China has sort of mastered the art of censorship, even they don't have the perfect formula for what you do when 1 billion new people are online, added to 400 million that are already connected. So China is less of a sort of guaranteed future than a lot of people expect because of this wild card. So we have to watch not just the physical dynamics, but the digital dynamics. The last sort of geopolitical issue I want to talk about relates to what I would describe as the Balkanization of the internet. So the world's, as I mentioned at the beginning, only 2.4 billion people out of the 7 billion people on Earth are connected to the internet. So still a minority of the world's population is what we would describe as connected. So in the next decade, as states go from a minority of their population being online to the majority of their population being online, what they're going to find is as difficult as it is to implement laws in the physical world, it's even more difficult in the online world. So the natural reaction as processing power devolves influence to citizens is that states are going to try to have the sort of, they're going to have the internet reflect the norms and the laws of the physical world. So we're already seeing this happen on some level, and that's why I call it Balkanization. So literally what that means is governments will filter out the internet. So as you're in the country searching, what you're searching for reflects the norms and the laws. So this happens on 3 levels today. It happens on a level that you would describe as politically acceptable. So the US and Germany have nuanced differences in terms of free speech in the sense that in Germany, neo-Nazi hate speech is banned. In the US, it's not. So if you go to Germany, and you search the internet, you won't be able to find neo-Nazi hate speech. If you go in the US, you would. That's what we call political acceptable Balkanization. Then you have countries like Russia, which I would sort of describe as the sheepish category, where they basically couch censorship of political opposition as child safety and other things. And Russia is certainly not the only place where this happens. And it turns out that they're very concerned about the well-being of the children, and so therefore it's important to censor out content of political bloggers and so forth. And then there's the blatant countries like China and Iran that are just sort of quite forthright in terms of how they censor. But the way we talk about Balkanization today is still on a country-by-country basis. In the future, if we don't do anything to stop the Balkanization, then the end result is like-minded states banding together to edit the web collectively. So you can imagine the political aspects of this, a bunch of politically like-minded countries forming a sort of Balkanized autocratic cyber union where they all agree to filter out content about political dissent in each of their countries, whether it's relevant to them or not. But let me give you a business example. Most of the censorship that happens in a lot of countries around the world is actually driven less by a desire to repress the population and oftentimes by capitalism. So I talked about China before. A big part of the nefarious cyber activity coming out of China is, in some respects, a form of modern-day economic protectionism. Block the competitors, censor the competitors, cyber attack the competitors. So you can imagine a situation where a group of like-minded, sort of asymmetric, capitalistly minded countries decide to form a Balkanization bloc where they all agree to censor content and block the sort of sites and platforms of a number of competitors. So these are the situations that we have to avoid. And the Balkanization, if it goes from being individual Balkanized states towards collective editing of the web, is not just about the health of the internet, it has a fundamental threat to business worldwide. So what does this mean for all of you as I wrap up? I'm sitting with perhaps the most illustrious business people in the region and the world. It used to be in the past that what happened geopolitically was sort of a curiosity. What happened with the markets was important and interesting, but it didn't really impact your business as much. Now, if you're a business, you're online, or if you're not online, you should be online, or if you're not online yet, your whole business is going to be online. So what that means is, given the digitization of geopolitics, every single one of your businesses is caught in the crossfire of geopolitics, whether you want to be or not. By virtue of how different countries are handling the internet, by virtue of different censorship models, by virtue of intellectual property theft, by virtue of cyber terrorism, cyber attacks, cyber criminality. I'm sure everybody in this room is concerned about cybersecurity, is concerned about employees' accounts being compromised, and so forth. So what this means is the business of the future, or even the business of the present, needs to not just think about sales and marketing and market share and strategy, but needs to be able to ask the question, what are we doing to ensure that our business's cyber defense department is not just on par with all those other functions, but the best of what we have to offer? If you're investing in a new company, the first question that you would ask is, as good as that platform is, can that company protect itself? And for individuals, every single one of us in the future is going to be increasingly splitting our time between the physical and digital world. Now, how many of you, by show of hands, have multiple email accounts? How many of you have multiple phone numbers? Multiple social networking profiles? So every single one of you, while you're one physical person, has a virtual entourage. So whether you want to believe this or not, you have multiple personalities online. You have your business identity, your social identity, your family identity. Maybe you have a rogue identity, I don't know. But what this means is the connected citizen is able to punch way above their physical weight in cyberspace. So the implication this has for citizens is fantastic because it means we're all more powerful. The challenge for businesses is it means that you want to figure out who your consumers really are, which means you need to understand the multiple personalities of each of your consumers. And then for governments, and I'll finish with this point, the fundamental problem you have if you're a government is, let's say you're a population of 80 million people, 80 million physical citizens. If every one of those citizens raises their hand when they're online as many times as all of you did, then what that means is online the population looks more like 1 billion people. So for a government, this becomes a very interesting challenge of having to distinguish between what is in fact real and what is in fact noise. So again, I don't think that the unprecedented empowerment that's being ushered in by greater connectivity means that citizens are going to replace governments, but it does mean that governments are ceding some control and influence to digitally empowered citizens. So what we're experiencing is a new professional and business, geopolitical, and personal environment where all of us have greater influence. And as all of us have greater influence, it's a moment of reflection. There's this sort of short window of time where the world's population is still coming online, which means that over the next decade, the decisions that we make as governments, as individuals in terms of what we want to automate versus keep as physically ours, as businesses in terms of how we think about the digitization of our business, these are decisions that will have consequences for decades to come. So I hope I've given you a lot to think about on the future of geopolitics, on the I hope I've gotten you to think a little bit differently about what this technological revolution in fact means in some of the world's most unlikely places. And I hope I've brought it back to what this means for all of you as you think about building businesses that, whether they're physically global or not, are going to be digital powerhouses. So thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me back to Turkey.